Welcome to the Lost Chronicles Vault.
It's great to be diving into the sources again.
Today, we're going right into the heart of a world unexpectedly at war. Those first bewildering years, 1914 and 1915, guided by the raw accounts we've gathered.
Yeah, the first-hand stuff is always so powerful.
Our mission in this deep dive is to understand a truly staggering miscalculation, the almost universal belief that this terrible conflict would be a swift affair, wrapped up by Christmas of that first year.
It's almost heartbreaking, isn't it? That certainty.
It really is, that fleeting hope for a quick return to peace.
What strikes me most powerfully about this initial optimism isn't just that it was wrong, but how deeply ingrained it was. Our sources reveal societies on all sides utterly unprepared.
Psychologically unprepared, you mean?
Exactly. Not just materially, but psychologically for the industrialized slaughter that lay ahead. This wasn't simply a hope. It was a widely held conviction.
And understanding why that conviction was so strong is key to grasping the mindset of the era. Exactly. The imagery from our sources is so vivid. Young men marching off with such confidence in bright, almost celebratory uniforms.
So much color initially.
Utterly oblivious to the mud, the endless gray, and the sheer brutal attrition that awaited them in those nascent trench lines.
It's a poignant, almost tragic contrast, the vibrant colors of expectation against the monochrome reality of what was to come.
Okay, let's start to unpack the roots of this misjudgment. A core element was the German strategy, right?
The Schlieffen Plan, essentially.
Built on the assumption of a lightning-fast victory over France, a sweeping maneuver through Belgium to Paris before Russia could fully mobilize its forces.
The German miscalculation regarding Belgium was, in retrospect, a huge hinge point. Their assumption of minimal resistance proved disastrous.
They just expected to roll through.
Pretty much. And crucially, their violation of Belgian neutrality wasn't just a minor diplomatic hiccup. It triggered Britain's entry into the war.
That scrap of paper.
Precisely. Britain had a treaty obligation, and this act galvanized public opinion there. It added a significant and perhaps underestimated adversary to the Western Front right from the start.
And beyond Belgium, there was a fundamental underestimation of France, too, wasn't there?
Oh, absolutely. The German high command seemed convinced of a swift French collapse. But then we see the extraordinary events surrounding the Battle of the Marne.
Oh, the taxis.
The taxis. Our sources recount, almost unbelievably, Parisian taxi drivers, ordinary citizens, answering the call, heroically transporting troops to the front lines. Can you imagine that?
Civilians directly intervening in such a fundamental way. It's incredible.
The story of the Parisian taxis is indeed a powerful symbol of unexpected resilience. But strategically, the Battle of the Marne was far more significant.
It stopped the Germans cold, didn't it?
It effectively stopped the German advance, preventing the swift fall of France that was central to their entire strategy. If we connect this to the bigger picture, this single hard-fought series of engagements shattered Germany's long-held strategic imperative, avoiding a two-front war.
Right. No quick knockout in the West.
Yeah, and that had massive consequences.
Absolutely. Instead of that rapid victory, the Western Front just calcified. The armies dug in.
Literally dug in.
And from this defensive necessity emerged that sprawling, unimaginable network of trenches, snaking from the North Sea to the Swiss border.
Yeah, our sources paint a picture of this vast scar across the continent, a physical manifestation of the strategic deadlock and the immense cost in human lives that was already mounting.
This shift to trench warfare fundamentally altered the conflict. It moved from a war of movement to one of static attrition,
Where the defender held a huge advantage, machine guns, barbed wire.
which meant that offensive actions, as we tragically saw, resulted in staggering casualties for minimal territorial gain. It was a new kind of war, one that nobody had truly foreseen.
Not on this scale. Not with this technology.
And within this new reality, we have the haunting accounts of what became known as the Kindermoor.
Massacre of the Innocents.
Yeah. Newly recruited, often incredibly young, German soldiers, fueled by patriotic fervor, were sent in a desperate counterattack against seasoned British professional troops.
The sheer scale of the loss of these young lives in that single engagement, it's chilling. A chilling foreshadowing of the devastating impact this war would have on an entire generation of European youth.
The Kindermoor, the children's massacre, the name itself speaks volumes about the tragic waste of potential in those early, chaotic months.
It starkly illustrates how the initial enthusiasm and the belief in a swift, almost romantic conflict were brutally extinguished by the cold, industrial reality of modern warfare.
Makes you wonder, how did the unfolding situation on the Eastern Front compare to this bloody stalemate in the West? Because it wasn't the same picture everywhere, was it?
No, not exactly. That's a crucial point to consider. On the Eastern Front, Russia's mobilization did cause initial concern for Germany, as intended by the Allied strategy.
They moved faster than expected.
Faster than the Germans hoped, certainly. Russia, driven by those complex ties of Pan-Slavism to Serbia and its alliance with France, found itself compelled to act on multiple fronts.
Right. There was the commitment to defend Serbia against Austro-Hungarian aggression, the spark ignited by the assassination, and the obligation to respond to the German attack on their French allies.
So Russia's divided loyalties and the sheer scale of their mobilization efforts meant their forces were stretched thin across both the Eastern and Western fronts.
Not a concentrated punch.
Yeah, exactly. While the initial numbers were daunting for Germany, their deployment lacked the concentrated power needed for a decisive early victory. This contrasted sharply with Austria-Hungary's initial overconfidence regarding Serbia.
Ah, yes, Austria-Hungary. They thought Serbia would be easy pickings.
Precisely. Austria-Hungary confidently anticipated a rapid and decisive victory over Serbia, a swift retribution for the assassination. But they hadn't accounted for the fierce and determined resistance of the Serbian army.
Remarkably led by their aging monarch, wasn't it?
Yes. This unexpected Serbian defiance not only halted the Austro-Hungarian advance, but also bought crucial time for Russia to mobilize and for the wider Allied response to take shape.
So while the West was digging in, the East saw a significant, though perhaps not decisive, movement early on. Serbia held out longer than anyone expected.
They really did. But what's truly fascinating here in the East is the Battle of Tannenberg.
A huge German victory, right?
Massive. In a surprising turn of events, one that even caught the Germans off guard, German forces under Hindenburg and Ludendorff inflicted a crushing defeat on the Russian army.
This really put Hindenburg and Ludendorff on the map.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
This victory not only inflicted huge losses on the Russians, but also significantly elevated the prestige and influence of these two German commanders. It demonstrated a clear German military capability on the Eastern Front, a bright spot for them amidst the growing gloom in the West.
It really underscores how unpredictable the early stages of the war were, how quickly fortunes could shift. The initial assumptions were crumbling everywhere.
Completely.
Yeah.
This was clearly not the short, glorious affair anyone had imagined.
And as the months wore on into 1915, Austria-Hungary began to show alarming signs of strain. Our sources detail truly staggering casualty figures.
Some 2 million men lost in just the first year of the war. The human toll was immense, almost unimaginable even then.
2 million.
And the sheer scale of Austria-Hungary's losses had far-reaching consequences beyond the immediate battlefield. The deaths of so many officers.
Especially those who could speak the different languages within the empire.
Exactly. Those who could bridge the linguistic and cultural divides within the multi-ethnic empire. Their loss exacerbated internal tensions and weakened military effectiveness considerably. Their ability to prosecute the war independently diminished rapidly, placing an increasing burden on Germany.
So by the close of 1915, the initial landscape of the war had been utterly transformed. The swift, decisive victories hadn't happened.
Not for anyone, really.
The Central Powers were locked in a brutal stalemate in the West, facing unexpected and determined resistance. And while they'd achieved some notable successes in the East, like Tannenberg, their overall strategic objectives remained frustratingly out of reach.
Which begs a profound question. Given this unprecedented deadlock, this horrifying loss of life, why didn't the fighting simply stop? What forces kept the war escalating into 1915?
It seems almost irrational from our perspective now.
Well, the reasons for the continuation of the war in 1915 are deeply complex, rooted in a potent mix of nationalistic fervor, strategic calculations, and perhaps by that point a sense of having gone too far to turn back.
Sunk cost fallacy on a horrifying scale.
You could say that. Germany, despite the deadlock in the West, drew confidence from their successes against Russia. A powerful nationalist narrative began to solidify, portraying Germany as a defender of its unique culture and civilization.
Defending against, what, Slavic barbarism and Anglo-Saxon materialism, that kind of thing.
Precisely that kind of rhetoric. Our sources reveal the emergence of this potent mythology of Germanic strength and cultural superiority, drawing on powerful Wagnerian Valkyrie-type imagery. It fostered a belief that they were engaged in a fundamental struggle for their very identity.
Which makes any thought of compromise incredibly difficult.
Almost impossible. France, on the other hand, faced a starkly different reality. Significant portions of their industrial and agricultural heartland, including the lost provinces of Alsace-Lorraine, were under German occupation.
They couldn't just stop with German troops on their soil.
Exactly. And the memory of past humiliations, particularly the defeat of 1870 at Sedan, fueled an unwavering determination to resist, to reclaim their territory, to ensure national survival. For France, withdrawal was simply not an option, it was existential.
And Great Britain, they weren't occupied. What kept them so committed?
Well, Britain, while perhaps initially more hesitant compared to France, found itself increasingly committed to the conflict by 1915. 1 million volunteers had answered the call to arms.
Kitchener's army.
That's right, fueled by a growing anti-German sentiment sparked by the invasion of Belgium and the perception of German militarism as a fundamental threat to democracy and international law.
We see that anti-German feeling cropping up in strange ways in Britain too, don't we?
Oh, absolutely. It manifested in striking ways within British society. The royal family, with its German lineage, famously changed its name from Hanover to Windsor.
And Battenberg became Mountbatten.
Right. Even cultural touchstones weren't immune. Wagner's music was often banned.
And didn't they rename German Shepherd dogs and Dachshunds vanished?
They did. German Shepherds became Alsatians. Dachshunds practically disappeared from public view for a while. It speaks volumes about the depth of national feeling, how pervasive it became.
It's a fascinating, if unsettling, glimpse into the pervasive impact of the war on national identity. Now, amidst this land war that spiraled far beyond any initial predictions, there is also the curious case of the great naval powers.
Ah, the dreadnoughts.
Both Britain and Germany had poured vast resources into building these formidable fleets, these dreadnought battleships, each anticipating a decisive, history-altering clash at sea, a modern-day Trafalgar.
Yeah, the expectation was for this huge climactic battle to settle things at sea.
Yet the grand, decisive naval battle that both sides had envisioned never truly materialized in those early years. The immense fleets, symbols of national power and prestige, largely remained in port.
A fleeting being, as they say.
Yeah.
Just the threat kept the other side cautious. While there were some limited naval engagements in the South Atlantic Coronel, the Falkland Islands.
But not the big Jutland-style clash yet.
No, not in 14 or 15. These were far from the climactic showdown that naval strategists had anticipated and the public had perhaps expected.
It's a profound irony, isn't it? These incredibly powerful and expensive instruments of war essentially remained in a state of tense inaction, a silent standoff while the land war raged with unprecedented ferocity.
A huge anticlimax, in a way. Now, while Europe was undeniably the central theater, the conflict wasn't entirely contained within its borders, was it?
No, the colonies. Though not the primary focus of initial planning, they inevitably became drawn into the widening struggle.
The involvement of colonial territories added another layer of complexity to this burgeoning global conflict. In German East Africa, for example, Tanzania today.
Leto Vorbeck's campaign.
Exactly. A protracted and surprisingly effective campaign was waged by German forces under Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, tying down huge numbers of Allied troops. But what's truly significant here, beyond the military aspect, is the impact this had on the colonized populations.
Seeing Europeans fighting each other?
And seeing the Europeans weren't invincible. They witnessed European powers locked in a brutal and protracted conflict, perhaps beginning to question the long-held narrative of European superiority.
And those seeds of doubt, those unfulfilled promises made to colonial populations during and after the war, would indeed contribute to the growth of future anti-colonial movements.
Absolutely. Long-term consequences that were likely unimaginable in the initial optimistic yet ultimately naive days of 1914.
Meanwhile, in the Pacific, German possessions were quickly snapped up, weren't they?
Yes. German-held islands, the Marshalls, Marianas, Carolines, fell to Japanese forces who were allied with Britain. And Australian and New Zealand troops seized territories like German Samoa, Papua, the Solomon Islands, and the Bismarck Archipelago.
It's a subtle but important foreshadowing of the Pacific theater's pivotal role in the Second World War and Japan's growing ambitions for expansion.
Definitely laying some groundwork there. The early years of the war also saw the tragic intensification of pan-nationalist ideologies and the horrific rise of ethnic conflict.
We mentioned pan-Slavism driving Russia.
Right, and pan-Germanism fueling German resolve. But there was also the Ottoman Empire's fervent pursuit of pan-Turkism or pan-Turanism.
The ambition to unite all Turkic peoples.
Yes, across the Caucasus and Central Asia. And this ambition, intertwined with the pressures and paranoia of the war, led directly to the Armenian genocide.
The systematic mass killings and deportations of Armenians within the Ottoman Empire. A truly horrific event.
It stands as a stark and terrible reminder of the human cost of these expansionist ideologies and the depths of a brutality that this new era of warfare could unleash.
And often still not fully acknowledged today.
Sadly, no. Simultaneously, driven by its own strategic imperatives, Britain declared Egypt a protectorate to safeguard the vital Suez Canal.
Protecting the route to India.
Exactly. And in a significant shift in its long-standing foreign policy, Britain even offered Russia control of Constantinople, Istanbul.
Wow, after decades of the Great Game trying to keep Russia away from there.
Precisely. A complete reversal, all in the pursuit of maintaining the Entente against the Central Powers. Keep Russia fighting.
Which brings us to another tragically ill-fated campaign of this early period, Gallipoli.
Ah, the Dardanelles. The Allied attempt to seize that crucial waterway connecting Europe and Asia.
The goals were ambitious, weren't they? Quickly defeat Turkey, open a vital supply line to Russia through the Black Sea, and potentially knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war altogether.
Hugely ambitious. But the Gallipoli campaign became a devastating example of flawed planning and underestimation of the enemy. The Ottomans, often with German help, had effectively fortified key positions prior to the Allied landings.
And the attacking troops, particularly the ANZ Sea Forces from Australia and New Zealand, walked right into it.
Met with withering machine gun fire on those beaches, Suvla Bay and Zak Cove.
The accounts of the ANZC troops at Gallipoli are profoundly moving, tales of immense courage and ultimately heartbreaking loss. Young men, full of idealism, facing unimaginable horrors.
It became a defining moment for Australia and New Zealand, a sort of bloody coming of age, but born from terrible failure.
The entire campaign became a symbol of strategic failure and the terrible futility of so much of the fighting in this war. They never took the Straits.
No, a costly failure. As 1915 progressed, the fronts continued to evolve elsewhere too. Serbia, which had resisted so bravely.
They finally fell.
Yes, Bulgaria's entry into the war on the side of the Central Powers proved decisive in the Balkans. The combined German, Austro-Hungarian, and Bulgarian forces overran Serbia swiftly.
What happened to the Serbian army?
Forced into a brutal retreat through Albania, eventually evacuated, but essentially dissolved as a fighting force on home soil, shifting to protracted guerrilla resistance alongside Montenegrin forces.
Another front solidifying. And then Italy finally entered the fray.
Yes, but surprisingly, on the Allied side.
Despite having been part of the Triple Alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary before the war.
Exactly. Driven by territorial ambitions against Austria-Hungary, wanting places like Trieste and Fiume, Italy, join the Entente powers.
So much for pre-war alliances, but their intervention wasn't the knockout blow the Allies hoped for either, was it?
Not at all. Italy's war against Austria-Hungary along the Asando River was marked by incredibly heavy casualties, maybe hundreds of thousands, perhaps even over 1 million by some counts later on.
For minimal territorial gains in that difficult Alpine terrain.
Precisely. This profound disappointment and a growing sense of national frustration and betrayal in Italy would later contribute significantly to the rise of nationalist figures like D'Annunzio and eventually Mussolini and fascism.
Another unintended consequence, laying the groundwork for future turmoil.
So as 1915 drew to a close, the initial hopes for a swift resolution had completely vanished. The war had devolved into this bloody, grinding conflict, a war of attrition with no clear end in sight.
And even within the German high command, they weren't agreeing on how to fight it anymore.
No. Strategic disagreements were emerging. You had Erich von Falkenhayn, the chief of staff, arguing for focusing on the Western Front to bleed France and Britain dry through relentless attack.
The logic that would lead to Verdun.
Exactly. Contrasting with the Eastern Front focus favored by Hindenburg and Ludendorff, flushed with their success at Tannenberg.
This strategic divergence foreshadowed the brutal logic of a war of attrition, a strategy predicated on the horrific calculus of inflicting more casualties on the enemy than they could sustain.
A grim precursor to the unimaginable slaughter of Verdun and the Somme in 1916.
And it was during this period, 1915, that we saw the first large-scale use of chemical weapons, right?
Yes, the Germans introduced poison gas, like chlorine and later mustard gas, at Ypres. While its military effectiveness was actually quite limited, wind could blow it back on your own troops.
And gas masks were developed relatively quickly.
Right. But the psychological impact was immense. It added a terrifying new dimension to the conflict, eroding any remaining illusions of a civilized war, a truly indiscriminate weapon.
So as that first Christmas of the war passed without the anticipated peace, The bright illusions that had accompanied its outbreak lay shattered, buried beneath the mud and the unimaginable loss of life across Europe.
The initial ambitions and catastrophic miscalculations had locked the continent in a brutal and expanding conflict, setting the stage for even greater tragedies to come.
The very failures and disappointments of this initial phase inadvertently sowed the seeds for future ideologies and global conflicts. It's quite staggering to trace those lines.
Consider, if you will, the immense chasm between the widespread optimism of August 1914 and the grim reality that unfolded in the subsequent months. What fundamental beliefs, what deep-seated assumptions fueled that initial conviction of a swift and decisive victory?
It's a question that continues to resonate even over a century later.
It really does. The disconnect is just profound.
Thank you for joining us in this chapter, and never stop opening the vault.